Thank you all for coming along tonight for what promises to be a very thought-provoking and stimulating session. This is another series of events that the University of Adelaide's MBA program is proud to play host to. And for those that don't know me, my name's Damien Scanlon and I'm the Adelaide MBA Director. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that the land we meet on today is the traditional lands for the Kaurna people, and I pay my respect to their spiritual relationship with this country. I'd also like to acknowledge Ms Pamela Martin, our Deputy Chancellor, and Professor Christopher Finlay, our Executive Dean of the Faculty of Professions, and all other guests. As you all know, this week is National Science Week, an important celebration and recognition of the vital role that science plays in every aspect of our modern lives. I should add that when I refer to the term science, I refer to the acronym STEM, that is, science, technology, engineering and maths. Without science, we are lost, literally and metaphorically. Today, the understanding of and appreciation for science and scientists in our modern society is more important than ever. I have watched with great dismay over the last few years as science has come under attack, an undeserving victim of the relentless political merry-go-round we're all watching go round and round. What has been most disturbing is that today, right now, we need science and scientists perhaps more than any other time in human history. The global challenges we face depend on science to find ways for our species to live and to prosper. It's not just the scientists that are important. We all are. The scientific literacy of a population is critical on so many levels for this future. Why? Because we make decisions that can have an impact, good and bad, short and long term. Decisions as parents, consumers, voters, business leaders. We need science, the business world needs science, and our kids need science. Before I joined the university, I was involved in setting up the Royal Institution of Australia with the late Professor Gavin Brown, a man who some years ago was the Vice-Chancellor of this great university. Gavin was a man who knew all too well that a bright future for all of us ultimately depended on scientists finding solutions to the challenges we know are ahead of us and for those that we haven't even glimpsed. Today, I listened to our new Vice-Chancellor, Professor Warren Bemington, talk about the University of Adelaide looking towards 2024. And reassuringly, he emphasised the need to connect our research to areas of public concern and, at the same time, enliven a spirit of freedom to investigate new fields of learning for those things we don't even know around the corner. I know we're in good hands. Today we'll be examining the interconnectedness of science and business in our modern economy and our society more generally. I'd like to welcome renowned Australian science journalist and publisher Wilson De Silva, our panel host. Welcome, Wilson. Wilson is Editor-in-Chief of Cosmos, which happens to be that magazine, Australia's #1 science magazine, and also I believe it's the highest rating iPad magazine. Is that the correct terminology? Yes. Throughout the world, that is. He's a past president of the World Federation of Science Journalists. His career includes stints at the ABC TV and ABC Online, Reuters at Canada, at New Scientist magazine, and as a staff journalist at the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. He's the winner of 31 awards, including twice Editor of the Year for his work on Cosmos, and Australian Film Institute Award for Best Documentary, something I don't know what that was about. Most importantly, and in the name of science and Richard Branson's bottom line, Wilson is scheduled to fly into space on Virgin Galactic in 2013. Wilson is joined by three scientists: Dr. Jan Johnson, Managing Director of the Australian Wine Research Institute, Dr. Anne Collins, Associate Director of One-to-One Bioservices, and Mr. Jim Wally, the CEO of Nova Group. Our MBA program can take scientists from the lab, or in Jim's case, from the cockpit of a fighter jet, the FA-18, into business and senior management. Today we'll hear from these scientists who, with the strength of the Adelaide MBA, have transitioned into the world of business. Our MBA graduates have to grab with both hands the best and the brightest ideas that our science communities have to offer. As I've said, we need science, science needs business, and business needs science. Perhaps that is now more than ever. Welcome once again, and I'll pass you over to Wilson, who's going to host a very entertaining and interesting panel discussion, after which there will be time to ask some questions from the audience. Thank you, Wilson.
And thank you, Damien, and thank you everyone for coming tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Science Meets Business. You can tell who's done an MBA here because they wear suits. And those of us who have not don't necessarily do that. The event tonight is put on by the University of Adelaide's MBA to help kick off National Science Week in 2012. If you haven't been to a Science Week event, you haven't been alive for the last 12 years because there are 800,000 events around the country and 1 million people go to them, which the math doesn't look very good, no. 800 events, sorry, 1,000 events and 1 million people. But I really appreciate you for coming tonight when, you know, you could have been watching The Project or Top Gear. So, you know, you've made a decision, a sacrifice, and I think that what it actually shows is you're an audience with good taste. Let me explain the format before we start. We'll have 40 minutes of discussion with our panel, and then 30 minutes or so of questions from our dashing audience, before we then wrap up with some last thoughts and conclusions from the panel. I'm using a laptop, by the way, because for some reason, technology does not allow you to print at hotels. So even though I emailed it to myself, some of it doesn't quite work on the iPad, nor on the laptop, nor on my iPhone. So let this be a lesson to you if you're developing a startup in technology, that you need to be, the show must go on, number one. Number two, you must be flexible. And I think it's something we're going to cover in our discussions. Okay, so what are we doing tonight? We are going, over the next 90 minutes, going to be looking at the intersection between science and business, between positrons and profits, perhaps, between DNA and MBA. Does it take business smarts to make science successful? Or do you need a career in science to really prepare you for the cut and thrust of business? Or is it a magical combination of both? I'm hoping that our panel, who have experienced both, will be able to elucidate for us. We lavish many of our most successful business people with praise and laud them in the business press. Well, we used to do it a lot more before they started getting convicted. But it's often been said that we don't recognize our scientists as much as we should, perhaps. Say nothing of science. But we're losing the sound, are we? But we certainly don't pay any attention to those people, and there are surprisingly many in this country, who have successfully straddled the line between business and science, who have taken the learnings from both and applied them in creating stellar careers and innovative companies. Well, that's where we're going to go tonight. We're going to cast the spotlight on 3 individuals who have succeeded in both science and business, and I don't think it's entirely accidental, they've undertaken an Adelaide MBA. To give you just a quick background, I know that Damien mentioned who is here, so to my near left is Daniel Johnson, who's Managing Director of the place that we're in, the Australian Wine Research Institute. Good on you, Adelaide, for scoring that. Which conducts research and development for the wine industry and employs 120 scientists. That's intense. 120 scientists, engineers, viticulturists, and winemakers. He's gone some business now too, having raised more than $150 million for research institutes and venture capital firms, and has been directly involved in 9 biotechnology startups. I'm hoping he'll give me some tips on IPOs. He's been at the Institute since 2006, beginning as General Manager of Business Development and running the commercial affairs and business relationships. The Institute's revenue, which apparently has been stratospheric since he started. But despite them growing to unprecedented levels under his stewardship, it would seem that he still found time to rough it out with the winemakers in Tuscany recently. I'm hoping he'll describe it for us. Dr. Anne Collins is Associate Director of the One-to-One Bioservices, a wholly owned subsidiary of Hospira Inc. Am I pronouncing it properly? Hospira?
Correct,
Yep.
yes.
A global company specializing in injectable pharmaceuticals and medication management. Is that for pain? Medication management?
Anything when you're in the hospitals, basically.
Okay, great, there you go. Anything if you're in the hospitals. One-to-One provides R&D and manufacturing services for Hospira's biosimilars programs internationally, as well as other pharmaceutical companies globally. She's also the founder of the biotechnology consulting firm, specializing in strategic development of human health products, and established the phase 1 clinical trials for novel biopharmaceuticals, among other things in her career. So I guess you've been in the drug business for a long time.
That's right.
Never heard that one, probably. Jim Whaley is the CEO and co-founder of the Nova Group, an Adelaide-based company which provides services ranging from flight testing and electronic warfare to system safety and satellite communication. Employs more than 300 people in Australia, the UK and Singapore, and has been named a Fast 100 company by the Business Review Weekly, and for the last 3 years has been in the BRW 50 Best Places to Work in Australia. Although he trained in physics and could have worked on a Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, he blew it to become an Air Force fighter jet pilot and later a test pilot. So yeah, there you go. That's our panel. Please welcome them. Now I'm going to start with you, Dan. My understanding is that most scientists in Australia kind of stumble into business. They kind of find, and then they suddenly find that they're good at it. But you began your science degree with the intention of getting into business. Tell us about that journey. That's an unusual one for Australians.
Well, for me, I guess it was very early on, probably honours level for me. The way you earn your stripes as a scientist is generally you go through and do your undergrad and your honours, and then if you're serious about a career in science, you'll often go on and do a PhD. And it was early in that transition from undergraduate into honours and then into PhD that I saw a lot of scientists that were working on things that they just found interesting. And there's a lot of scope for that in society. I think a lot of discoveries have come from that serendipitous work where you're not necessarily pursuing an outcome, but you come up with something useful anyway.
Can I raise your voice a little bit?
Sorry, is that better?
Yes, better.
But for me, that wasn't what really floated my boat. I was interested in doing science that had an application, where I could see it and end use. So when I was doing my doctorate, I was working on some technologies which I subsequently formed a biotech company around, and got really interested in the patenting process, taking a product to market, which I subsequently did in the US. Did a postdoc along the same lines, and then went and joined one of the local groups here called Bioinnovation SA, now BioSA, giving out grant funding to biotech startup companies, and was there at the time when one of the life science venture funds was formed. And so I really became quite interested in the commercial side of science, picking ideas from 100 of opportunities, picking the handful that would really, you felt would actually have a commercial return and a product that would hit the market.
You were picking winners.
Yeah, tried to. And then from there, it was a bit of a hop, skip and a jump across to wine science, when they were looking at trying to transition from an academic-based approach to white lab coats and so on, but to bring commercial thinking to the way science was done there. So I joined that institution 6 years ago, and in the last 12 months was appointed the MD.
So did you have this thing, do you have an interest in science? Did you have a family background in business? What brought the two together for you?
Not really. Science was always in my heart, but numbers were in my head. I always knew that I'd love to be exploring what was unknown, but it always had to be in a commercial context for me. It wasn't enough just to understand why. It had to be why with an ability to do something about it. No family background in science, no family background in wine. Just was always.
But you managed to adapt.
Yeah, I hope so.
To the whole wine thing, certainly. Well, you've been practicing for years.
Yeah, so I think I came from a different perspective. My career was always around finding something that interested me, always being able to learn something, but also I wanted to travel the world. And for me, it was finding a career that would enable me to do all of that. So I started out in science, very quickly transitioned into engineering because science was little things and I couldn't see it, but engineering I could carry buckets around, which was a lot more fun. But I quickly learned that I had to get out of the lab, and that's when I moved into the pharmaceutical
So what happened?
industry.
Was it a particular incident? You spilled some acid on yourself, or no, this is not me. There goes that dress.
There goes that dress. I think it was probably I was working in New Zealand at the time, and I'd been asked to do an experiment looking at yeast, but they were looking at yeast as a byproduct. So I was asked to drive the car up over the Rumitaka Hills out of Wellington over to the flats where there was a winery. and I had to, sorry, not a winery, a continuous fermentation beer manufacturing place, and I had to collect these 50-litre drums of yeast, put them back in the car, and try and go back down the hills. And I got pulled over by the police once, and I had to burp these bottles, and of course the whole car smelt of alcohol. So that for me was my thing. Maybe the hands-on stuff is really not for me.
The travel component, Dan, that's an element that's also attractive about science, but business as well, because one of the great thing about science is you do interact with people on a global, well, if you've liked, science was the first global market, wasn't it? Where people exchanging letters, exchanging information with each other, data. But, so science has always been global, but it does allow you to travel a little bit, doesn't it?
Yep, absolutely. I work in a fairly niche scientific area, grape and wine science. There's not that many people that you meet at a barbecue that would say, that's what I do for a living. There's a global talent pool of maybe 1,000 people.
Really?
And so recruiting is quite a challenge. But the way to tap into that effectively is to collaborate. And so when our institution collaborates, it's often with institutions that are in parts of the world that as a tourist you might want to visit anyway. So it's a convenient fringe benefit. Working in wine generally has great fringe benefits, as you can imagine. But also when it comes to travel, it's great. So south of France, Italy, Spain, Canada, US, Chile, Argentina, New Zealand, South Africa.
This is the kind of stuff you had in mind, Anne.
That's right, yes. Unfortunately, I went from the UK to New Zealand, back to the UK, and ended up in Adelaide. And look, who wants to leave here?
Right, there you go. Well, you found your niche, though. You found your niche. And you actually think that you're extremely lucky to be in Adelaide. Tell me about that.
Why am I lucky? Well, look, I think everybody knows what a great place Adelaide is to live, but I actually work for a global company, a global pharmaceutical company, so I work across a network of people based in the US, through to Croatia, through to India on a daily basis, and we're working in a global marketplace. And I sometimes have to pinch myself that I can have this lifestyle, but I'm actually out there shaping a global marketplace.
Right, and doing it from here. We're doing it from here, which you
That's
can
right.
these days.
That's right.
You can these days. Now, Jim, fighter pilots are usually shy and retiring people who find it difficult to take risks, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm typical of the breed.
But you managed to overcome this and become very entrepreneurial. Can you tell me about the path you took?
My path was probably more accidental or an entrepreneur than intended one. I literally went straight out of the school into the Air Force, did a science degree, and I'd always loved science and physics, but I'd always wanted to be a pilot. And my career progressed through the Air Force. Because I had a science, physics bent, and was interested in the technology and the engineering aspects of it. Test pilot school was a natural thing to do, getting involved in flight test, and I particularly used to like breaking things, and one of the great things about being a test pilot is you get to break things, and it's a profession. Engineers get to fix them. And basically I came to the end of my Air Force career, and I had intended to keep on going and join the higher echelons, but I met an Adelaide girl that ruined everything, and it was a choice of choose wife or choose Air Force. And I'd lost first wife to Air Force who'd asked me the silly question, if you had to choose between me and flying, darling, what would you choose? And I said, don't ask the question if you don't like the answer, and she did. Anyway.
See what I mean by shy and retiring?
Second time round, I thought that might be careless, and so I didn't really want to be a Qantas pilot. And I actually was doing the MBA, and I actually went along to one of my MBA professors, a guy named Bill Arger at the time, and said, look, I'm leaving the Air Force, which organisation in Adelaide is going to have the good fortune to employ me? And he said, well, the problem is that all you're qualified to do is drop bombs on people and shoot aeroplanes out of the sky, so I don't think anyone will have you. And I said, thanks for your encouragement. And so it was like start up a company, and that was the start of it. So it was literally an accidental start to my entrepreneurial career.
But how did you get to... Okay, so you enjoyed breaking things. Actually, I have a nephew who I think might be a test pilot in training. Really,
Absolutely.
He loves
and
to break
fighter
things.
pilot.
Yeah, so that's great.
Yeah.
But people don't realise how much, on the test pilot side, how much understanding of physics and mathematics is absolutely essential to what it is you're doing. Because you need to explain to the engineers what happened while you were flying. Yes, they've got some data.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think one of the things about being a test pilot, particularly, I did a year on test pilot school with the Royal Air Force in the UK, and it's basically a military equivalent of Masters in Engineering, but there is you know, a lot of maths, a lot of the aerodynamics, a lot of the engineering, a lot of electronic engineering, a lot of weapons engineering. And one of the things the test pilot needs to be able to do is bridge that gap between the engineer and the scientist who's developing the aircraft and the pilots, you know, out in the frontline squadrons who are flying it, and be able to explain why it doesn't fly properly, why it can't be used for a particular role, to be able to characterise things like flying qualities in terms that engineers can understand, like, you know, static, you know, apparent longitudinal static stability, or actual...
So you actually get involved in the R&D, don't you?
Oh, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the R&D work the test pilot gets involved in is not only obviously lending some operational expertise and some technical expertise to it, but also making sure when they are actually doing the testing that they're doing it in a sensible way, and you're not sort of flying 600 knots at sort of 50 degrees nose down, 50 feet above the ground, which is...
That's not good, right?
Often what you're asked to do.
Right.
Yeah. And I guess the other thing that's quite interesting too is actually looking at a real systems engineering approach. So looking at an aircraft, for example, as a wider system that involves the people in it, involves the engineering, the software, the process, the procedures. And one of the things I really, really enjoyed was that holistic approach to I guess engineering and product and system development, where you looked at the users, who was going to use it, their skill levels, and all those sorts of things, and how you design cockpits. And yeah, it was great, really interesting.
So tell me, Jim, let's walk backwards from where we were. We'll start with you first. What were the courses that you took and ended up eventually you taking an MBA? So what kind of training did you take?
So, I mean, you know, school was pure applied maths, physics and chem. During my degree, I predominantly did a physics major and maths minor, so it was you know, a lot of thermodynamics, electromagnetism, space physics, astronomy, did a few units of astrology as well. Lots of physics, maths, you know, pure maths applied units. Then when I was in the Air Force, there's obviously a reasonable amount of engineering, mechanics, aerodynamics associated with just general pilot training, and then test pilot schools was again just more and more of the same, but really getting into some quite complex aerodynamics, and particularly, you know, supersonic aerodynamics, which is, for any of you that have any understanding of aerodynamics, know that there's some quite, you know, different things change when an aircraft goes for the speed of sound. So it's just getting into that more complex, higher level.
I'm intrigued. Did the astrology help in any way?
That was a joke.
Okay. Boom. Missed
See,
that one.
there are too many scientists in this room. Not really. But having said that, there is a saying amongst fighter pilots is better to be lucky than good. So sometimes it's good to look at your stars before you go flying.
And Anne, what about you? What's the path that led you to, just in the degrees that you got or the qualifications that you got?
I think for me it was an opportunity. After I'd done my degree, I realised that science really wasn't for me, but I couldn't really work out what it was, which is why I transitioned into engineering, because it still had that, you know, for me it was about the logic, being able to solve problems, being analytical. So I moved into that, and I ended up doing a PhD in that. But a lot of that decision-making around that was fairly fortuitous and opportunistic, because in the UK, and I'm not going to give away too many secrets, but in the early 90s, there was a recession, and there just weren't jobs around. So when you're given an opportunity to be able to study for an extra 3 or 4 years, get yourself a PhD, and play hockey every Wednesday afternoon, it was an opportunity for me to do, you know, to do that. And it was a decision now I look back on, and I'm very grateful for that opportunity. And that took me, you know, traditional path from there into a postdoc, but it never quite gelled for me. And I took that decision after being in New Zealand that I had to come back, I had to get out of the lab, but use those skill sets, those transferable skill sets that I got through doing a PhD, you know, being able to problem solve, think of big pictures.
We'll tackle some of that, but was there an element of, you know, the whole fear with the flashbacks from the, you know, brewing episode?
No, I don't think so. Okay. But it is, you know, I still have a passion for the technology. You know, I still have, if I couldn't do the job I'm doing now, if I didn't have that scientific engineering background. And it's that passion to see those technologies move forward into products that have benefit for people that is what makes me go to work every day.
You were nodding then quite strongly, Dan. You really agree with this thing. You have a real feel for technology, a real passion for it?
Being close enough to science to have it blow your mind every day without being the one that does the pipetting,
Yeah.
I think is the common ground here. And listening to the other guys speak, it seems as though we all retain a real active interest in the research. You never lose it. It's right. It's in your heart. Science is kind of who you are, and it's a framework for thinking about anything that you have in your life. You isolate one variable, you study it, is that having an impact on this thing or not? Okay, well, let's discard that one, let's look at this variable and play with that one. It's a way of thinking, and once you get a real feel for science, even though you might not be wearing a white lab coat, you never quite lose it.
Is it a bit of a puzzle working out, or is it being there and figuring out something for real, knowing that you've discovered something where you've got to a point where you know something and other people didn't know? What's the attraction on the science side?
Look, even now, I love it when someone says, I've got a problem with my aeroplane, can you come and fly it and tell me what's wrong with it? And it's so satisfying.
And you break it.
Yeah, well, you do, or hopefully you don't, but it's so satisfying to get an aeroplane that is not flying straight, or it's got something, and there's been a dozen pilots fly it who are not test pilots, and you do a couple of simple test techniques on it, and you say, it's that, and you land 10 minutes later and say, oh, couldn't you work it out, or is there something wrong? So no, I've worked it out, it's, the balance of this or the bringing it
So
out.
it's problem solving. That's
yeah,
a real
and
attraction.
it's really satisfying. You know it's a skill you have and others don't, and it's nice to be able to do it.
I think there's a bit of a view out there sometimes that scientists who decide to go into business are those who can't cut it as scientists. And I think that's a very flawed assumption. Certainly, I could have had a career in science. I'm sure my colleagues here could have done the same. It's not a case of having an inability to do that. It's a preference to work in a different area of science. But the fact that you've got that grounding is what gives you the ability to spot opportunities in a business context as well, and then explore it right the way through to the technical detail. So systems biology, you can see it coming, you can see the potential of it.
Talk to us about it as an example of how you saw an opportunity and you jumped on it.
Okay, so systems biology is a way of thinking about organisms, human, a cell, whatever it is, that is a holistic one. So rather than the old school view of science, I'm talking quite old, was reductionist. You'd get a cow and you'd pull out a liver and you'd study the liver, and if it performed this way, you'd assume that when you plugged it back into the cow, it would perform in the same way as when you pulled it out. Systems biology is about understanding the liver in the context of every other organism of the cow, every other organ rather of the cow. So in our specific instance, we're interested in yeast, which is a very important part of winemaking, and obviously grapevine, and understanding how genomics, the genes link to proteins, which link to the metabolome, the individual compounds in a wine, and how that all overlays with bioinformatics, data management, to bring it all together and make sense of it, of what is an incredibly sophisticated and complex system, and even though it's one of the most simple that's ever been studied.
But yet you need that to understand that last 2% that you were talking about.
It's integral.
Okay. What about how did racking up 5,000 flying hours on 40 types of aircraft, from helicopters to fighters, how the hell did that help you in business? Or was it a case that it unnerved your competitors, if there are actually any left?
One of the things about flying high-performance aircraft, and particularly test flying, is you do need to be able to think on your feet. And you are sometimes faced with situations that it doesn't help if you panic and wave your arms around everywhere.
It doesn't?
No, it doesn't help. And,
I'm going to tell some people in the office, because seriously, the Cosmos office sometimes...
Yeah, well, I'm sure it's some office. So I think in business, I mean, one of the things I find is when things are going pear-shaped in business, and everyone, well, not everyone, but people are sort of getting a bit stressed and all that sort of stuff. It's like, this is not going to kill us. You're not going to die, end up in a flaming wreck. So, don't get your heart rate up too much, and let's work through it. And when you are about to die in a flaming wreck, then guess what you do? You do exactly the same thing. You work out what the issue is, and you try to solve it. And I
when
think
the going gets tough, you just go icy.
Oh, it's not icy. You just think about things in a rational way, and I think that's the whole connection with science. It's about thinking in a rational sort of way, and not being emotive. And it's literally applying scientific technique. Assess the environment, assess the tools you've got, situation, experiment. You know, there's a decision-making process that's used in aviation, which is all about doing that. Just situation, analyse, SATI, situation, analyse, decide, implement, and evaluate. And it's very, very similar to scientific technique. And I think applying that logic in business situations, and even in situations in relationships with people too, just understanding the dynamics is really important. And I think I think it's a bit of a stretch, first of all, as a bachelor's qualified or master's qualified person to compare myself with 2 PhDs here. But I think if you have that background and that logical thought process, I think it helps you quite effectively in business. The difference, and I think Dan made a good point about those fluffier grey areas. I think you can still use logic in those areas, but you just need to understand that those fluffier grey areas are, a bit spongier, and they've got, they're what I would call areas of probability. They're just not black and white. But, and you've got to account for those and do some, do a bit more analysis to look at the extremes and what can and can't happen.
This is what neuroscientists call deductive reasoning. Is what you guys are talking about with science. Very, very. You're trying to find a particular, very detailed and very defined fact. And inductive reasoning is working with possibilities. Like, well, on average, I think this is what I'm facing, but I'm not really sure. But on the basis of that, I can make decisions. But thinking that this is what's happening.
And it is implement and evaluate. And it happens in business, and it still happens in aeroplanes. I had a bit of a catastrophic engine failure in an aircraft about a year ago, and it was a whole process of, right, this is a situation. I've got white smoke coming out of the engine and oil all over my left arm, and things are not looking good. And what is it? Looking at the instruments, evaluating it. I think it's that. I'm going to do a small experiment and put the power up a bit and see what happens. And the banging got worse, so right, let's take the power back. Go through the whole process and just go through a process and sort it out. And you do exactly the same thing in business. You go through and say, let's just tweak these things. Let's spend a bit more money on marketing, on business development. Let's maybe look at how, have we got the right people over here? Have we got them sufficiently trained? Tweak their skills, change a few things around, and evaluate what happens. And if that doesn't work, then do it a bit more. So it is using that deductive process.
So when you had the flame out, you obviously hadn't checked your horoscope that day.
Hadn't checked my horoscope. It was one of those days where, things weren't going. Well, actually, in the end, I had, literally in the last year, I've had 2 life-threatening engine failure or potential engine failures. And
note to self: don't fly with Jim.
Note to self. I need some wood here. Sorry. And I made, on both occasions, I made it back on the ground in one piece. So my wife was disappointed, of course, because she's got me well insured, and the aircraft was worth about $1 million as well. But she reckons she could have got the house renovated a lot quicker and bought a new husband as well. So whilst you get that fear, I did make it back in one piece, relatively unscathed.
Well, yeah, because you had to come to here. You had to come to this thing tonight. So, and is failure important? Most people in business seem to fail a few times before they really take off. I'm thinking of your biotechnology consulting firm that didn't really work. But maybe Dan and Jim can have insights too. I certainly know that people, Steve Jobs talks about his failure was when he was trounced out of Apple, was the best thing that ever happened to him. Is this important too in business, to make mistakes?
I think if you look, if I just take the pharmaceutical industry or the biotech industry, of every new idea somebody has, it's something only like 10% that actually makes it to market. If that, there's a huge failure rate, and they will fail for a number of reasons. It could be the technology, it could be a failure because the market changes, it could be a failure just because there's not the commercial or the money to drive that through. So I think the motto is you've got to keep trying, you've got to learn from your mistakes, but also if you're going to fail fast.
If you're going to fail fast. Did you hear that, Jim?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's true. Absolutely true. Yeah.
Even on the plane?
If you're going to quit early.
Yeah. So you don't waste,
waste money, resources, and time.
Is that what's in science called you need a false positive so that you can avoid going in that direction?
If you're able to demonstrate that, yes. And I think that's, for me, that's the big difference between science and business. For science, as we heard, it's all around making decisions based on data and facts.
I think, it is an interesting point, and I think you need to understand that all three are important, and you need to understand what you're good at, And if you're not good at others, make sure you surround yourself by people that are. And I think one of the really good, fighter pilots typically make very, very quick decisions with limited amounts of information. Pure engineers, and I do have a science engineering background, as I say, make decisions over a longer time frame and get as much information as they possibly can. So it's a well-informed decision. So there's several different dimensions to decision making. One of them is time, the other one is effectiveness, and the other one is the amount of information. And you need to understand that some decisions need to be made quickly and get them on and just move them on, or else they won't be effective. And others you can take time. And I think if you balance those people out with you and I, when I'm going, ready, shoot, aim, the engineers say to me, well, hold on, can we just stop there and think about that? And sometimes I say, yeah, all right, we can. We've got a week and we can do that. But other times I say, guys, we don't have time. We're going now. And you've got to appreciate that. But a lot of the time when they say, put the brakes on me, they're doing the right thing, and let's progress that. And I think it's balancing that and understanding.
So let me turn it around the other way. Where business people who come and do an MBA and already maybe have the fuzzy skills, they probably have the gut skills and they have the heart skills, but they don't necessarily have that training in science. Do you think it offers you an edge that they otherwise can't have, particularly when it comes to facing uncertainty? One of the things about science is you don't know something, but you can think through the problem to have, to increase the probability of being closer to what reality is. Yeah. Do you think that helps at all? Or am I just confusing you guys?
No, I think there's people that do it in an intuitive sort of way, but I think most scientists do it in a more logical way. And
Does it give you an edge, Anne?
I think it does, but I think one of the things for me, the great thing about the MBA, there's a lot of work when you do working with teams. So it comes back to what you're saying. You understand what your strength is, and you try and build on the strengths in the other team. And it's having that maturity to understand the benefits that everybody can bring to solve a problem. So if you're the person who can think through something logically, but you've got someone else who can think laterally, well, that's great. Yeah, helps.
It's learning to do with people, isn't it, Dan?
Yeah, I think it is an advantage for me to have that blend of skills in the role that I have right now. If I was running a creative design company, I'd be useless. So context is very important.
So I've been running one of the founders of Cosmos, and I noticed that the type of person you hire changes slightly the job and how it's done, because you end up figuring out what that person's strengths are, and you encourage those strengths and buttress them. Encourage them to flower. And people's weaknesses, you try and compensate for them by buttressing around it. And I think, is that something that you learn from people, that actually it's not just the role that they have, it's actually the person in that role that actually can make or break a particular role? It's an HR sort of question.
It's definitely, we all operate well in different environments, and some environments we're well suited to. And I think, it's the old square peg round hole, and you have to make sure that the individual you have in a particular position is suited to that position. Their skills are.
So not one of those people that go, there's a crisis.
Absolutely. And sometimes those people that are a bit more emotional and all that sort of stuff actually do add value to the organisation, because they are more sensitive. Well, maybe not in the cockpit, but they are more sensitive to the feelings. And honestly, there are people in my organisation who I will talk to about something that I just think is a totally ridiculous decision, and I'll go and say, what do you think about that? And they'll go off their rockers at it. And the thing about it is, when they do that, I know, well, actually, there's probably another half dozen people in the organisation that will be in the same situation, and I had not even thought about that.
Yeah, it's a different way of looking at things, isn't it? The same data. Yeah. That's intriguing.
Coming back to the MBA, one of the most useful things I got out of it was learning about myself and the gaps. So when you do these various tools, particularly early on in the initial subjects, and you're profiling yourself and doing, certainly for me, exercises that I hadn't done before, and it all made perfect sense. That's why I don't get along well with an individual that has that kind of character, or this is clearly where I have a gap on this side. And it encourages you to almost see yourself as in the third person and say, look, Daniel, you're good at these things, but you're not good at those things. And surround yourself with people that you can go to and ask for their opinion, and be brave enough and self-assured enough to know that you can't be good at everything. You have to go and ask these people for advice.
It sounds like you've been trained in the force. Ooh, searching deep inside. Well, look, let me ask you about startups, because you've had some experience in startups. So VCs, venture capital, in the USA, there's an extraordinary explosion of venture capital always has been a tradition of people risking when it comes to technology. Not so much here. Is that changing, or do you think it's always going to be difficult?
It's a good question. The fund I was involved in setting up is very much active and in the process of starting to exit some of its investments. There's people in the room that would know more about where that's up to than me.
Exit is a good thing, right?
Exit is where you get your money back and then hopefully a fair bit more.
Right. It doesn't mean they're abandoning them. They're taking profits.
Right. Your earlier comment about failure, I think, is relevant here. The US seems, in my experience, to have a much greater tolerance of failure. If you've been associated with a small biotech startup that's failed, it's seen as a kind of badge of honour, and as long as the reasons for the failure were the right ones, it's
not ones that got you into jail or anything.
Correct. But if there are good, solid reasons for you to have entered into these kind of things and failed, it's seen as not a bad experience for you to have gone through.
Because guess what? Next time you're going to so avoid making that sort of mistake again.
Right. So I think there's definitely scope for it to change in Australia. Culturally, I think getting over that aversion to being associated with somebody who has failed in the past maybe is something that will take a little longer.
Yes, and it's also, isn't it, and the perception of risk. For example, people are willing to invest in a mining lease that is very, very prospective. It's a skeptical investment. But phase 2 clinical trial is a much better bet, you'd think, than just taking out a mining lease. How do you... Is it a cultural thing about Australians? I know that you're originally from Britain, so is it different in Britain, or is it...
Yeah, look, I think risk, as you said, it's very much about perception. I think if you took a poll around the room about people who perceive the risk in taking a flight versus a car, people would perceive the risk as being higher to fly, but, actually it's much more dangerous to get in your car. So it's all about...
Unless you're flying with Jim.
Well, there's always that, yeah. And I think it's the same in the biotech industry. I see here in Australia, just because of the funding or very difficult to raise funding to advance early stage technology, they actually, historically, they list a lot earlier than you would see, say, in the US or in the UK. And as a result, you see listed companies that have much broader visibility failing more often than overseas. So it gives a perception of a high-risk industry, whereas I don't see it as necessarily any more risky than the industry elsewhere necessarily, but because we're having to list, it gets the profile area, that whole perception of risk in the industry is high. And I think also because there's a lot of people doing analysis on companies that have got technology backgrounds and maybe not having the depth of technology or understanding of the risk of the technology, we see poor business decisions through lack of understanding of the technology, which is why, for people running businesses where technology is there, having that fundamental understanding, I think, is key.
Well, there you go. We're going to go to questions in a minute. Do we have a mic that we can... Yes, we have a mic over there. So while we're getting there, I'll just ask one question to Jim. Do you think there's a lack of, just following on this question, do you think there's a lack of appetite for entrepreneurship in Australia? Is that the issue?
I think we are less forgiving of people that fail in this country. I think there is a much greater amount of stigma associated with failure here than there is in particularly places like the US. I think that's backed up by our legal system, all sorts of things. I think that the system in the US, it is just inherently a more tolerant and encouraging of entrepreneurship system, and I think as a result, you do have people that tend to be more entrepreneurial. Having said that, there's behaviours that you get as a result of that, which are obviously not great as well. So I think there's a balance, but it does sadden me that I think we are not willing to take risks, and I see it, for example, in our defence industry where people are just not willing to invest in developing equipment or systems because we might stuff it up slightly. And it's like, if you look at every other nation in the world that does it, I'm really sorry, but that's what happens when you develop new gear. It happens when you develop biotech, develop anything.
Well, high tech is high risk.
Yeah, it is, and people don't like it.
Damien's going to marshal the questions for us.
Just before I take questions from the floor, I just got one question for you, Jim. What was your call sign?
I did temporarily have the call sign Virgil, and now I guess I've got to very briefly tell a story about that. As a young fighter pilot at 75 Squadron, I was based out of Katherine in the Northern Territory, which for any of you who have been in Northern Territory is in the middle of nowhere, which is a great place to be if you're screaming around at 2,000 kilometres an hour and making a lot of noise. And at one stage I was trying to impress a nurse at the Katherine Hospital about what a wonderful person I was and how I could fly. Unfortunately, I had a few drinks and chose to demonstrate my flying abilities by jumping off the top of the nurses' quarters. And I landed on the ground, sort of still drunk, and then that was all fine. Anyway, Monday morning, went up to go to walk, and I pulled both my Achilles tendons. And for 3 weeks, I was walking around like Virgil on the Thunderbirds. And so I became Virgil.
Right, thank you.
Thank you for that, Damien.
That's all right. I couldn't resist. I thought it might have been Iceman or something original like that from the movies. Right, over to you folks. After that very stimulating discussion, it's time for those that may have some interesting questions. Got a question over here.
Mike's coming around to you.
Question for Dan. I take it, correct me if I'm wrong, but your organisation provides advice to grape growers and winemakers, right? Mm-hmm. Do you find much resistance from winemakers who trust their intuition and the way they've been making wine for, perhaps decades? Do they have a distrust of the science? And if you find that, how do you combat that?
It is a good question. Winemaking is part science, part art, and never the twain shall meet at times. Most people who make wine, in the Australian wine industry at least, have gone through an enology degree, and that is, with the exception of 1 or 2 subjects, a chemistry degree. So most of them come into a winemaking role with their head full of science. So they have a very good understanding of the technical detail. When someone like us, our institution, goes out and says, we have a new enzyme. If you heat your wine to 70 degrees and you add this enzyme, you don't have to do this, this and this later in the processing, it'll save you money. There is an inherent resistance to taking it up, but there is at least a capacity to understand what you're talking about. The resistance comes just as a result of an inherent, we've been doing this forever, do we really need to change? This product's been around 5,000 years. And my response is, well, the Romans probably thought they were making the best wine as well, but our wine making now looks nothing like what it did back then. So there's always innovation, always opportunities to do something better and different. And you'll get those that are typical innovation curve. You get your early adopters, then the late majority, and you get laggers at the end. And there are people that would just have no interest in science at all. The people who have biodynamic production systems, for example, low minimal intervention, no sulfur, all the kind of things that would... They eschew anything that represents science because philosophically they don't like to go down that path. But we're talking 1 or 2% of the industry. The great majority embrace science, understand what it can do for them, making costs of production or quality improvements.
Do we have any other questions? David.
So what we have here is obviously a highly selected and atypical group of people, because the fact of the matter is that most people who are successful in business don't have any background in science. They have a background in law or finance or something else. So is it a very small proportion of people or is it a very niche area where people who have a science background and a business background can prosper, or do you really need the science?
Well, I might just answer that question, seeing it's quite topical given that we've just finished the Olympic Games. Back in the 90s, I was the chief executive of a company that tried to make money out of science, and it was a combustion science organisation. And I had to try and understand some of the fundamentals of the science. But I used to fund some research into here at this University of Adelaide because I could see an opportunity on a global scale of what I believe that science could deliver. And the cauldron that you saw during the London Olympics was actually that company, and it was the cauldron over many cauldrons over the last few Olympics. And so I don't have to, I think it's about, you don't need to be a scientist to see an opportunity. You don't need to be a a business or a law person to see an opportunity. I think it's about seizing the day and being first, perhaps. And like all things, no one ever undertakes a high-risk venture unless there's a high return. That's pretty conservative. That's what conservative means. It's you actually only will ever undertake a high-risk venture if you've got a high return attached to it. So that's my take on that. Is any?
I'll make one small comment before we go to the panel. In this day and age, I noticed this. I used to be a business reporter, so I'm comfortable in business, and we started our own business with Cosmos, is a publishing company that was started. I was one of the founders, so I've always been interested in business. But in this day and age, I don't see how you can be. A lot of my friends who are lawyers and who are in business have to study up on science because it's in everything you do. They'll ask, what is this social media stuff? What is this? They have to understand technology. Everyone's using it so much. It is so embedded in our society, both technology and science, we don't even think twice about it, that to not understand it is actually becoming a detriment to you. It actually slows you down because someone like Dan can see an opportunity in a science that is emerging and take advantage of it versus a competitor that might not. And I think that's what we're getting to as lawyers. I have a friend who's a barrister, and she says in her, in DNA evidence and all this sort of stuff, she has to read up mounds and mounds of material on this sort of stuff before she goes to court because she really has to try and understand this. And it's not having a science background really restrains her, she says. But please, anyone?
I'd make an observation that I've got a lot of lawyer mates as well, and doctor mates, and and obviously engineering mates as well. I find at the time most of the people I deal with, by the time they're in their sort of late 20s, early 30s, they've done at least one master's degree, possibly a PhD as well, if they're in an engineering science field. I don't think that's typical of a lot of lawyers, for example, and I do wonder if you've followed a science, technology, engineering, maths, then whether to get to a what's regarded as an acceptable level, beyond just having a basic degree, that you have to have done more study, and that just gives you less time for starting businesses and doing other things. I don't know, but it does strike me that if you go down a law path, you're involved with business much earlier on in your career, whereas if you take a science path, you tend to be hands-on and really, really focused on a particular area of science for a long time before you either make a conscious decision to go and get involved in business. You're just not inherently involved in the business side of things. Be interesting.
That's changing though, where there's more and more companies. I mean, that's been the case in Australia for a very long time. But isn't that changing as more and more companies become startups and actually deploy science into business? You start seeing some people in places like CRCs, the Cooperative Research Centres, they're actually interacting with research institutes, university, and they're interacting with business at the cutting edge, whether it's a mining company or whatever. They're actually playing in the commercial world.
Yeah.
So I might just say, for me, I know I couldn't do my job if I hadn't got the technical background that I do. And I know when I'm recruiting people, I have to look for that. Even recruiting people for a business role, I have to have that key technical skill behind it for them to be successful. I think one of the challenges, though, is science and engineering for people coming into degrees at the ground level isn't considered sexy anymore. And to encourage enough people through to do that basic science as a foundation to move into more business roles, I think is going to be the challenge for the economy moving forward.
I think it comes back to the individual a lot as well, because not every scientist would make a good MD of a large company, clearly. I'm not sure that I would. Where I think my strength is in risk management. So I'm coming up with new technology, but I'm managing risk on behalf of an industry who then has to adopt it. If they adopted it and made a mistake, the consequences could be catastrophic. So I'm kind of managing risk on their behalf. Whereas other scientists, would take big gut feel punts and make a big decision. So we talked about Marius Kloppers. I think he has 2 PhDs. He's running BHP Billiton. Clearly he's scientifically very literate, but clearly he's also capable of taking massive bets and trying to, take over Rio Tinto and other things in the process, which he didn't succeed at, by the way. But he thought very big and it was all gut feel. So I think it depends a lot on the individual.
Yeah, I'm not sure about those investment decisions he made, but I won't comment.
Hello, Melanie Bagg. I'm a scientist and science communicator and currently doing the MBA as well. I was wondering how you guys feel that having a science background helps you deal with scientists in your organisation. Do you think it gives you an edge in that sense? Is that one of the big reasons why it's good to have a science background?
Yeah, look, I think for me, because I'm managing teams of scientists and engineers, sometimes they'll pigeonhole you as the business person up here and they don't think you understand what they're talking about. And then you can scare them sometimes when you can come in and understand what they're talking about.
I think there's a credibility issue, and I think if you're leading an organisation, and if that organisation is predominantly, in my case, about engineering, and because I have a science engineering flight test background, I think people respect that you've got a fair degree of knowledge, and you've also been at the sharp end of what they're doing. So and inherently we look up, we do associate better with people that have had similar careers to ourselves.
Does that mean you also tend to hire people who have a science background because you feel that they bring something to the business?
I actually really like to get people with different backgrounds, not too different, because I think it actually adds a bit of balance to the organisation. But I know also when I do, sometimes they find it challenging in the organisation. And seriously, it doesn't take much to be. Like we started off as predominantly ex-military people, and forget about being a scientist. If you've been wearing a uniform for most of your life, and then you meet a civilian, as we lovingly refer to all of you, then I still refer to them as civilians, and it's a cultural gap. Just one of the reasons I've injected more civilians into the organisation.
Jim, you're surrounded by cities.
I know. It's all right. I'm not afraid.
Stay calm.
I'm not afraid. But one of the reasons for getting more people with different backgrounds into the organisation is just that, so that we are just a little bit broader and hopefully more able to relate to the client.
I agree with Jim's point about credibility, but also overlay that with the ability to have a BS filter. If somebody comes to you and they're talking long technical things and you don't have an ability to say, look, you're full of it, and you are, you can waste a lot of time and have the wool pulled over your eyes.
Yeah. That's what my IT department do to me every week.
Adam.
Yeah, Adam, just a quick question, just going back to the fuzzy side of things, the cultural side of things. Do you find sort of in your industry, because you're all up there in business, you're all in there in science, that you meet more people like that? Do you bring more people like yourselves to the industry and bring them and so they can also harness the ideas of bringing science into business? Like, are there more people out?
Are you saying we're finding more people like these guys here? Or are these the only 3 guys in Adelaide?
Yeah.
It's growing, isn't it? Surely it's growing number of people who are going from...
There are people that are naturally, and I wouldn't actually pretend to be one. I mean, I have some guys and girls in my organisation that have got an engineering science background, but they are just naturally out there and thinking different things, and they are business developers. And there are others in the organisation that just want... I've got some of the guys, particularly that work in electronic warfare. And they used to work in a building that has no windows. And they'd get there at 7 o'clock in the morning, they'd leave at 7 o'clock at night, and they couldn't talk about any of the work they did. And they do not relate well to the rest of the world. They relate very well. I'm making gross generalisations. I hope there's not too many electronic warfare engineers here. But they relate very well to themselves because their projects are all classified and all that sort of stuff. And they just typically, they are not good to put out in front of clients. There are others who, come from other fields often, who are just great. They get out there, they're enthusiastic, they're effusive, and they can sell stuff and they convince you. I've got an aeronautical engineer who is our chief operating officer, and honestly, I could put him against my brother who's a lawyer in Minter Ellison in London, and he'd argue him to death. My brother who's a lawyer would have no choice. They're just good at, winning discussions, and so I think it's part personality. And it's,
Do you think it might be passion, Jim?
Yeah, a bit of passion. You've got to wave your arms around and do all that sort of stuff.
If
You've got to
don't-
be excited.
But if you don't understand the vision of where you fit in an organisation, where it's going, then it's very difficult to be passionate, I would have thought.
Well, I think that's the thing about organisations. I'm sure Anne and Dan have the same experience. That you want to number one, be clear and articulate about what the passion and the vision is. And if you do that, then hopefully you attract people with that same passion and vision, and then you all go in the same direction.
Part of the issue is also cultural. Our business press might laud, the Alan Bonds of this world or whatever, but they don't laud the scientists who have done really well. There are at least 3 I can think of, Australians, who have made hundreds of millions of dollars from investments or, things they've invented or things they're involved in. And we don't even know who they are. Now, I happen to know them, but why is it that we Americans know who Steve Jobs is? Americans know these people and we don't. They're not in our business press. And our press is much more interested in either, they're not even interested in manufacturing anymore, they're interested just in miners. So I think there's a cultural issue too. We should know all of these. We should know these 3 people. We should know a lot more people like this, but we don't. I think they're out there. And good on you for bringing them out, Damien.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Right, just over here.
Being at least one stage further on in life than most people here, I didn't feel the need to put a suit on tonight, even though I do have an MBA. I'm sort of intrigued, having been through a working life, starting in science, a Bachelor of Science in Physics, going into the oil industry, going into management, becoming a country manager in that industry, then getting involved in intellectual property commercialisation, startup companies, an angel investor group, and then since I retired, going back into science with climate change. And it's been an interesting progression, but the thing that concerns me and that I want to ask the panel about is our society is fundamentally based on science. This city is not livable without science and without people coming through the system to understand science. My wife works at one of the large colleges in Adelaide, and her role is to move children from school to the next stage of life, whether it's university, trade, or something else. And I get the impression that not enough of them, or not enough of society, understands how vital science is. And the question really is, what do the panel think should be done about it?
Well, I think what we were talking about just then actually has a lot to do with it, that we don't read about it in our newspapers, about science and about business opportunities in science. We don't even read about scientists at all. They're like the, I don't know, some kind of weird cousin that we have in the attic that is treated and ignored, and yet we all rely on science. We all love using iPhones and tweeting and whatever else. But yet, Carl Sagan said a civilization that relies on science but is ignorant of it is in danger, and that's kind of what we're facing. It's less of a problem in some other countries, but it's a general problem. Now, we're doing what we can, by raising awareness generally, but we need a lot more people doing it. We need newspaper editors taking this seriously and running stories. We need it so that parents read stories, and that parents don't discourage their kids from taking engineering or math because their kids show an interest in it, and they say, well, is there a job in that? What's an astronomer? Who's going to employ you as an astronomer? And that's because they're not reading in their papers. You might think, oh, look, I'm making too much of an argument because I'm a media person. But actually, that's the tableau, the wallpaper of life that we have. And if you don't see examples around you of scientists doing well, if you don't see examples like these 3 people, or hear of those examples that I mentioned but I didn't mention their names, if you don't hear of them, they don't exist, therefore you don't think they're real. So that's my bit.
Well, I suppose the very reason why I wanted to do this show tonight was because it's part of National Science Week. Yes, we have a context, but science can lead you anywhere, and I think these 3 panellists are very good examples of that. And the MBA can be a fantastic catalyst to get you to those other places, but there are other catalysts as well. So I think this is one example of actually telling a story not within a normal scientific context, It's actually, we're talking about business, which everyone's quite comfortable with, less comfortable with science, but there's a story there. And that's what our job is. Part of management education is recognising that we have to manage whatever we make as well. And so you can't actually separate them. And so we're in that space as well.
Any comments?
Yeah, look, I just might comment on that, because I think it's, when I was at school and you're making decisions about what you're going to do, the sort of job I'm doing now never even crossed my mind that it would even exist and where science could take you. And I think I try and do a lot of work with some of the students coming through Oz Biotech and things, and again, you're talking with people who made the decision to do science degrees, but they can't even see the opportunities that are open to them with that foundation. So I think it is something that, you know, as individuals and as sort of industry organisations and universities, is about getting that message out there that science is not just about the lab, it's about a lot more than that. And this is National Science Week, and you know, this weekend I took my daughter down to Science Alive, and it was just a great environment there. So many things that are scientific based, from simple building bridges to all sorts of things. But there was one thing that just really upset me. She ran off because she could see a lot of kids having fun, and it was all about fun, but they were dressing the kids up in white lab coats, putting wigs on that was out here, big glasses, goggle-eyed, and they could start pouring liquids and have their photo taken as a scientist. And it was this image that people were portraying of scientists that I think it was all about a bit of fun, but it was sending the wrong message that this is what science is about. And I think that's where, you know, some of the challenges are, is taking people out of that stereotype.
Yes, indeed.
It's a massive question. We could spend hours and hours on it. I'm encouraged by where the Australia's chief scientist is going. He's identified maths, physics, chemistry, the hard sciences, which is obviously where I come from and I'm most interested in, as being real shortages. Lack of demand for places and universities, lack of interest in the secondary schooling system, and he's working on initiatives to try and do something about it. Whether he'll have any success or not remains to be seen, but at least it's creeping up the radar a little bit. I don't know what else can be done. It's
I reckon, basically, I reckon science and maths teachers, particularly in high school, should be paid 50% more than all their counterparts. If we seriously want to do something radical about it, I mean seriously, if we want to do something radical about it and get more kids doing it, we need to have the best teachers attracted to being science and maths teachers. And without that, because at the moment it just doesn't happen. Teachers are not interested in doing those things. They're not well paid anyway, but I think bite the bullet, pay them allowance or bonuses or whatever. But if you become a science and maths teacher, particularly at high school, and also maybe in primary school as well, then you should be at the top of the tree as far as your profession goes, and you should be paid better than your colleagues. No issue with it at all. We do it in any other world. You know, it really irritates me, no end, that I go and pay $300, $400 an hour for a 28-year-old lawyer who's got a simple degree, and I can charge $150 an hour for a PhD qualified or a triple master's qualified engineer. You know, just stupid. Sorry for the lawyers here.
Won't talk about economics. Yeah. Okay, one more question and then we'll wrap it up because I'm conscious of the time. So I've got a question over here.
Yeah, this is kind of a slightly different angle at this. If I'm more comfortable with science maybe than business, like say, from talking about, let's say, students in a technical degree, you could, for instance, any of you could have stayed in your jobs, you could have working for someone, you could have stayed in that field, but what causes you to go out and think, I'm going to do something on this thing on my own, I'm going to go out on my own. As in, for instance, with a lot of my colleagues, we throw ideas back and forth, and there are plenty of great ideas there, but what causes you to go out and say, I'll start this?
Well, in my case, as I said before, it was my wife that made me do it, so I know with these guys.
In my case, it was a belief in a technology I was working on while in the lab, and I couldn't attract the interest of the tech transfer unit of the university that I was at, but I believed in it, So I arranged to have a company formed, the intellectual property assigned into the company so that I could go and get grant funding and pursue it. And I was able to straddle the two for long enough that I could continue on with my PhD, get that done, and then continue off with the company. So for me, it was just about a belief in what it is that I was working on. If you believe in it strongly enough, just do it. There are resources available and people in the room who can assist with that kind of thing. If that's what if that's what's behind your question, there's a commercial opportunity that you're working on, or you want to take your career in that direction, there's plenty of people here who can help.
Okay. Before I thank our fantastic panel, I'd just like to ask each panel member, including you, Wilson, because I don't think you expected to be asked any question. In just a minute, what did you think you got out of tonight, particularly for scientists and then for those that perhaps might be considering a degree outside science?
I'm impressed with tonight's panel, and I don't just say that. I'm impressed because I've always believed that business and science work very well together, and we don't see enough of it in Australia. I see it overseas, and it's great to see examples here, other than just the three that I know who have done really well. You guys are fantastic. You really are. You're driven by the passion of science, but you also want to make an impact in the real world. Scientists do that too, but it's just that they've chosen to. They have a longer lead time. You guys have a tighter lead time. You want to see stuff in the market now or the next year. And I think that's really, really exciting to see more of that in Australia. So that's what I've been.
Thanks, Wilson. Start with you, Jim.
It's nice to know there's some similar people out there.
1 minute, sorry.
Yeah, nice to know there's some similar people out there, and I think there are people that have gone through this very similar path, and I think that passion for science and for being able to use it as a tool to help improve the world, because I think it is, as we've talked about before, it is a tool to help improve the world. And I think to take it and improve the world, you do need to have some business behind you and commercial expertise behind you, particularly in the world today. And I guess what I've learned is that there's a few people that are interested in those aspects of it, and I've got some panellists here that are obviously of similar mind to my own.
So look, for me, there were a number of reasons why I took the MBA at Adelaide, but one of those was because I wanted to be able to network more broadly across Adelaide's business. When you come from outside, but you're also in science, someone said to me once, when you do a PhD, you learn more and more about less and less. So for me, doing the MBA was to learn those business skills, but to be able to network more broadly and apply those across different industries. So coming along tonight and seeing that network and hope being able to make new colleagues, networks here tonight is going to be a key thing.
Thank you, Anne.
I think that the integration of science and business is inevitable. I think that as competition for funds continue to increase every year, the need to integrate fundamental understanding with practical utility is only going to increase. We've seen it increase over perhaps the last decade. I think it's only going to become even a stronger movement. So that even those who have a passion just to do fundamental science will have an increasing need to say, well, what's the end point in that eventually? So I think what we're discussing is essentially the future of where science is going. Not to say there's not a place for fundamental science, there is. I fully support that and have done it myself. But putting it all in the context of a return to the public, the Australian government puts 9.4 billion-ish into R&D in a year. What's the return to the public from that? There needs to be articulated in a way that perhaps we haven't had to as a community in the past.
Yes, well, it's not about choosing science or business, and I think you can both. I think what I've got out of this panel discussion is that we need both. They go hand in hand. If we can't, in our sort of generally capitalist world that we live in, if you can't make money out of science, no one's unlikely to undertake it. But at the same time, we're not likely to have products to sell or solve problems without science. So we can't actually talk about them differently. I hope tonight's been a very interesting and worthwhile exercise. I thank you very much for coming, and I'd like you to thank our esteemed panellists here tonight. Please help yourself to drinks and food as they come, and hopefully we'll see you at the next event. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Just thank the University of Adelaide MBA program and the Business School, and also the people who put tonight on, Carol, Neil, Charles, Daniela, Lisa, and Margaret. Thank you very much. And thank you to our fabulous panels. And you for coming. You.
Thank you, Wilson.